It should have been a routine flight. Nothing about it hinted at the storm that was about to come. Not the polished check-in, not the schedule, not the email confirmation that had buzzed her phone 30 minutes prior. Layla Booker walked into the private terminal as she had dozens of times before. Her name was on the flight manifest. The aircraft was hers, registered under her holding company. Everything was in order, except for one thing: the pilot. He stood just outside the lounge, uniform pressed, nameplate catching the light. Todd Hansen. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't introduce himself with the usual neutral professionalism. Instead, he looked at her like she'd wandered into the wrong building. His voice was clipped when he spoke, the words stiff and slightly off-key. There was no mistaking his tone. He thought she didn't belong. She told him she was the client. His eyes barely flicked to her luggage. He asked who the actual passenger was. She repeated her name, this time slower, firmer, letting it hang between them like a challenge. There was a pause, then a thin smile from him that wasn't really a smile, just tension disguised as courtesy. He told her it was unusual to see an owner arrive without staff, without someone else handling arrangements. He asked again if she was sure. That was the moment she knew this wasn't about logistics. It was about her being a woman, her being black, her walking into a terminal where people still assumed wealth and ownership came with a certain look, a certain skin tone, a certain background, and she didn't fit that frame. Never had. She tried to keep the conversation professional. She reminded him, calmly, that the aircraft in question was hers, that she had a meeting in Geneva, that this wasn't her first international charter, and certainly not her first time dealing with contracted crew. His replies were vague, measured, passive-aggressive at best, borderline insulting at worst. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use slurs. But every word was a gate locking shut. Every sentence said, "I don't believe you." She could have called her assistant to confirm. She could have pulled out the ownership paperwork, rattled off registration numbers, forwarded the email from the aviation company. But she knew what this was. Proof wouldn't change his mind. Not really, because he'd already made a decision the second she walked in. Someone like her couldn't possibly own a jet. The woman at the front desk had sensed the shift. Her polite demeanor faltered just enough to betray her discomfort. She kept her head down and tapped nervously on her keyboard, but the tension had filled the space between all three of them. Layla didn't need to explain it. She didn't need to call it what it was. Everyone in the room already knew. And still, she stayed measured. She told the pilot again that she was ready to board. She asked if there was an issue. That word, issue, hung there too, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. He said no, but his tone said otherwise. He turned away before she could finish her next sentence. Said he'd go inspect the plane. That was how it always went, wasn't it? A quiet dismissal wrapped in procedure. A man walking away not because he was needed elsewhere, but because he didn't want to be held accountable for what had just unfolded. She didn't follow him, didn't call after him. She let him go, but she didn't let it go. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from Leonard, her business partner, checking in before takeoff. She told him there was a delay, told him she might need backup. She didn't offer details, but he didn't ask. Leonard had been in enough rooms like this to know exactly what that meant. He promised to stay on standby. Layla made her way to the lounge, sat down, and pulled up her tablet. The Geneva meeting was hours away, but she wanted one last look at the pitch deck. It was a merger that had taken 6 months to negotiate. If this meeting went well, her company would double its footprint across Europe. Generational wealth, boardroom access, equity in spaces built to exclude her. And yet, here she was, still needing to fight for permission to board her own plane. Minutes passed. A server approached and offered her coffee. She accepted. He returned quickly, polite but distant. Another employee trying to navigate the discomfort in the air. No one was saying anything out loud, but the silence said enough. She glanced toward the window. The jet gleamed under the sun. She'd chosen the model herself, outfitted the interior, built the brand that paid for every square inch of that aircraft. And now, a man she'd never met was stalling the flight because he couldn't reconcile the image of her with the title of owner. She tapped out an email. Not to HR, not to a generic support line, straight to the CEO of the aviation firm, bullet points, timelines, a clinical breakdown of the encounter. No emotion, just facts. The facts were damning enough. When she hit send, she didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last, but it had to be the one that left a mark. Far across the terminal, she saw Todd speaking to another crew member. His body language was animated now, agitated, defensive. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She could read every posture, every sidelong glance. He was spiraling, and she was done waiting. The coffee sat cooling beside her. She didn't touch it. The real heat was coming. Layla kept her eyes on the jet as the minutes dragged on. She wasn't checking for technical delays. She was watching the people. Todd hadn't reappeared, but two crew members lingered near the gate, heads bent together in conversation, casting occasional glances in her direction. There was a rhythm to the situation she'd learned to recognize: polite stalling, subtle avoidance, covert whispers dressed as protocol. It was never about the plane. It was about control, about power. And in this case, it was about someone trying to reclaim a piece of it after she'd disrupted the narrative. Her phone buzzed again. "Leonard? Everything okay? Want me to step in?" She tapped back a short reply. "Handled for now. Stay close." She didn't want to escalate yet. Not unless she had to. Across the lounge, Claire, the same woman who had checked her in earlier, returned with the coffee she'd promised. She set it down gently, as if trying not to draw attention. Layla thanked her, then asked for her name. Claire paused, surprised, and gave it. Layla acknowledged her with a quiet nod. It wasn't just politeness. It was intention. She wanted Claire to remember that she'd been seen too, that professionalism didn't go unnoticed, that her place in this room mattered. Claire left, shoulders lighter, but Layla could feel the air hadn't shifted much. The room still pulsed with a low, quiet tension. It didn't rattle her. She'd weathered worse. But it reminded her of something she could never quite put down. This wasn't about rudeness. It was structural, coded into the pauses, hidden in the assumptions. The jet, however, remained ready, its engines silent but waiting, like the moment before a performance. Her jet. Every inch of it built from years of pitching investors, flying economy on red eyes, getting doors slammed in her face, and opening her own when none were offered. She'd put in too much to let someone like Todd fumble the narrative today. The presentation still glowed from her tablet. Slide after slide of market insights, trend forecasts, and long-term strategies. Geneva wasn't just another expansion. It was legacy. It was about creating access and ownership in an industry that still kept the gates too tight for people who looked like her. And now, instead of running through pitch transitions or tightening talking points, she was drafting an internal monologue on why she still had to fight for acknowledgement in rooms she paid to enter. She reread the email she'd sent to Elite Aviation's CEO. It was crisp, professional, every fact supported by timestamp or witness. She knew better than to lead with emotion. Those were too easily dismissed. But truth was heavy, and it left bruises, especially when you wielded it without apology. Her eyes flicked back toward the jet. Todd had returned. He was gesturing again, louder this time, though still trying to keep the conversation confined to his side of the terminal. The younger crew member beside him looked uncomfortable, occasionally nodding, occasionally glancing toward the lounge like he wanted to be anywhere else. Layla didn't need audio. She knew the script. People like him didn't back down easily, not because they had logic on their side, but because they were so unaccustomed to being questioned, especially by women, especially by black women. Todd wasn't confused. He was threatened, and like so many before him, his version of order meant reasserting control, even if it meant tearing someone else down. She placed her tablet face down on the table and stood, not in anger, but in clarity. She wasn't going to wait to be called back to her own plane. If anyone needed to face facts, it was Todd. The sound near the gate sharpened as she approached. He caught sight of her and stiffened. His jaw moved like he was preparing a rebuttal. But she didn't let it happen. She spoke first, calmly, firmly. She reminded him again that she was not only the passenger, but the owner of the jet. She addressed his earlier remarks, the delays, the passive challenges, to her authority. She told him flatly that she wouldn't tolerate another second of it. He began to interject, something about ensuring protocol, but she shut it down. The paperwork had been filed, the ownership verified, her authorization confirmed. What was left wasn't due diligence, it was defiance. And then she said what needed to be said, that if he couldn't accept the facts of who she was and what role she held here, then he needed to step aside, because he was no longer just a nuisance, he was a liability. He froze, just for a moment. The younger crew member stepped back instinctively, sensing the shift. There was nothing theatrical about her tone. It was steady, cold, not anger, but consequence. The kind of voice people remember not because it was loud, but because it made things happen. Todd's attempt to defend himself landed somewhere between denial and deflection. He said he treated all clients the same, that he was just doing his job. But even he didn't sound convinced. She let him speak, but only long enough for him to bury himself deeper. Then she reminded him, again with the language of leadership, that no job gave him the right to question someone's identity without cause. No protocol authorized disrespect, and no company should keep employees who turned prejudice into procedure. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with resignation. Todd nodded stiffly and turned away, the bravado stripped from his posture. He hadn't lost his job yet, but something had cracked. And whether he realized it or not, this morning had changed things. Layla didn't return to her seat, not yet. She walked past him, eyes steady, feet silent. The gate agent caught her eye and gave a slight nod. The message had been delivered. Now it was only a matter of time. Layla returned to the lounge, calm on the surface, but fully aware the situation wasn't over. Her presence might have forced Todd into temporary silence, but silence wasn't surrender. Not from men like him. He had backed off because he had no choice, not because he'd understood what he did wrong. That kind of awakening didn't happen in a single conversation. It took consequences. She sat back down, reopened her tablet, and began editing one of the slides. Not because it needed changing, but because focus was her anchor. Her pitch was airtight, her numbers solid. Still, it helped to center herself with something within her control. Outside that lounge, too much was loose. Her mind traced the way Todd's eyes had narrowed, how his voice had tightened. She knew that tone, knew what it carried beneath its professional coating: resentment, wounded ego, disbelief. And resentment rarely faded quietly. Claire reappeared minutes later, asking if she needed anything. Water? More coffee? Layla looked up and thanked her, asked again for her name. Claire repeated it, this time with less hesitation. Layla took the moment to tell her something small, something true, that she appreciated her professionalism. Claire smiled, not broadly, but it was real, a flicker of relief, maybe even pride. Layla saw it, noted it, let it pass. Her gaze returned to the jet. The sun had shifted slightly, light now reflected at a sharper angle, glinting off the fuselage. It looked perfect, untouched by the turmoil unfolding on the ground. Every detail of that aircraft had been chosen with purpose, from the brushed metal finish to the stitched leather interior. It was more than transportation. It was proof of her work, of her decisions, of the hours, months, years no one had seen. And now it sat waiting for a man who still didn't believe she had the right to own it. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Leonard. It was an email notification from Michael Connors, CEO of Elite Aviation Services. She opened it. Dear Miss Booker, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. Please rest assured that we take your concerns seriously. Captain Hanson's actions will be thoroughly investigated, and appropriate measures will be taken to ensure this behavior is not repeated. Should you encounter any further issues, do not hesitate to contact me directly. Sincerely, Michael Connors, Chief Executive Officer, Elite Aviation Services. She read it twice. The tone was professional. The response was prompt. She appreciated both. But Layla also knew corporate language when she saw it. Emails didn't fix systems. Actions did. Still, it was a start, a flag planted, a record made, something no one could deny later. Claire returned again, this time with a quiet nervousness. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, and told Layla she'd overheard fragments of conversation near the gate. Todd had been speaking again, angrily, in low tones, but loud enough for meaning to leak out. He was pressing the younger crew member, saying things like, I don't care who backed her, and people forge documents all the time. Claire didn't want to overstep, but something about his voice had chilled her. It didn't sound like someone trying to do his job. It sounded like someone trying to find a reason to sabotage it. Layla thanked her again. No alarm in her voice, just acknowledgement. Claire nodded and slipped away. The picture was sharpening. Todd wasn't just unsettled, he was grasping for control, and his language was getting reckless. The phrase, people like her, hadn't been spoken out loud, but it echoed in every sentence he'd said so far. And now he was muttering about forged papers, questioning official documentation, invoking fraud where there was none. She didn't need to wait for another conversation to know where this was going. She began drafting a second email, this one a direct addendum to the first. She laid out what Claire had told her, careful to mention that it came secondhand, but that the pattern was escalating. She added that any further delays would be interpreted as obstruction, that she expected a response within the hour, that she expected resolution before wheels up. She didn't press send, not yet, but she let the message sit in her draft folder, ready. It was a net she might have to throw at any moment. Out near the gate, Todd was pacing again. The younger crew member had backed against the wall, arms crossed, face tight. Layla couldn't hear them, but she could read the energy. Todd was losing the thread. The more he talked, the more defensive he looked. And now, he was dragging others into it. That's how it always started. One man's ego bleeding into the entire operation. She watched for a moment, then returned to her notes. Todd didn't know it yet, but the decision had already been made. It wasn't about whether he would face consequences, it was about when. Whether it would come before the jet left the tarmac or after. Whether he would walk away quietly or make it messier than it already was. Another buzz. Leonard again. Any updates? Do I need to step in? She typed back quickly. Not yet, but something tells me this isn't over. Stand by. And she meant it. Something was still turning. Todd hadn't been humbled. He'd been cornered. And cornered men didn't retreat. They lashed out. He was a pilot, used to control, used to deference. And now the person he'd written off had pushed back and won. For the moment, anyway. She set the phone down, folded her hands in her lap. Let the tension sit. Let him make the next mistake. The next time Todd approached, it wasn't with questions. It was with another attempt at asserting authority, this time cloaked in concern. He walked in with urgency, claimed he had a few final verifications before takeoff, and asked for clarification on some inconsistencies in the documentation. He kept his voice low, his phrasing measured, but Layla saw through it immediately. It wasn't due diligence. It was sabotage masquerading as standard procedure. He claimed her signature on one of the aircraft ownership files didn't match the database. He said the itinerary hadn't been submitted properly. He mentioned a possible delay while his team cross-checked with dispatch. But every excuse fell flat because she'd already reviewed every document that morning. She knew every form, every code, every piece of protocol. Nothing was out of place except him. She cut him off mid-sentence. There was no anger in her tone, only exhaustion. She told him, clearly, finally, that the conversation was over. His doubts had been voiced, his implications made. She wasn't going to indulge another round of coded resistance. Todd pressed again. This time, less carefully. He said he had concerns about the integrity of the flight. He didn't look her in the eye when he said it, because even he knew it was a reach. He wasn't worried about safety. He was worried about being outranked. Layla stood and delivered the ultimatum. No more discussions. No more speculation. She reminded him that she was the registered owner, that her authorization had been confirmed by Elite Aviation, and that every attempt to delay the flight from this point forward would be documented and escalated. If he couldn't reconcile his role with her authority, then he needed to remove himself from the flight immediately. He didn't respond. Not at first. He just stood there, lips tight, arms crossed, visibly wrestling with the weight of what she'd said. The flight crew around him shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. They knew what they were watching. After a long pause, Todd muttered that there would be no further delays. He turned and left without another word. Layla didn't sit back down. She walked to the edge of the lounge, facing the terminal window, keeping her eyes on the aircraft. Her coffee was still sitting untouched on the side table. The heat had long since faded, but her focus hadn't. She sent a second email to Elite Aviation, this time including the specifics of Todd's latest move. She detailed the false claims, the delayed tactics, the fabricated inconsistencies. She copied the timestamped documents for verification. She made it clear this was no longer just a personnel issue. It was a liability. Moments after hitting send, Claire appeared again, this time more solemn. She'd overheard Todd speaking to the young crew member by the gate. He'd said, in a voice low but pointed, that people like her always try to play the system, that he wasn't going to be the guy who looked the other way just to keep the peace. The young crew member hadn't responded, but Claire said the tone had turned darker, more personal. Layla thanked her quietly and told her to speak to no one else about what she'd heard, yet. If this escalated, Claire's account would matter, but she didn't want her dragged into it unless necessary. Claire nodded and stepped back. Out at the jet, activity resumed. Bags were loaded, systems were checked. It looked like progress, but Layla knew appearances didn't mean resolution. She received a call, this time from a restricted number. She didn't answer, but moments later, another email from Elite Aviation came through. Subject line, immediate attention, incident involving Captain Todd Hansen. Message, Miss Booker, we are taking this matter seriously. Captain Hansen has been contacted directly. He has been instructed to proceed with professionalism and complete the scheduled flight without further issue. Upon arrival in Geneva, he is to report to our regional office for immediate review. Any further disruption should be communicated directly to my office. Regards, Michael Connors, CEO, Elite Aviation Services. The message was clear. The system was now in motion. Todd's actions were being watched. But Layla knew he wouldn't go down quietly. Not yet. She gathered her things and walked toward the gate, slow and steady. Claire intercepted her to say the jet was cleared for boarding. Todd was already on board. The rest of the crew had assumed standard positions. As Layla stepped onto the tarmac, the wind tugged gently at her coat. She climbed the stairs, entered the aircraft, and took her seat. Todd remained in the cockpit. No words exchanged, just distance. She looked around the cabin, clean, modern, precisely the way she had designed it. A space that represented years of work. Every deal, every risk, every door kicked open had led to this, and still she had to defend her place in it. She buckled in. The attendant offered her water. She accepted. Her phone buzzed again. Leonard, need me to make a call? She typed back, he's quiet now. Let's see how long it lasts. The engines whirred to life. The jet rolled toward the runway. Todd didn't speak over the intercom, didn't offer a welcome, didn't acknowledge the owner of the aircraft seated just 20 feet behind him. But Layla didn't care. This wasn't about pleasantries anymore. It was about finishing the flight, then finishing what he started. The meeting at the Geneva Conference Center delivered exactly what Layla had expected. The boardroom was full, every seat occupied by executives who had flown in from different corners of Europe, all curious to hear what she had to offer. Her pitch was clean, deliberate, and unshaken. Not once did her voice falter. Every graph she showed, every word she spoke, landed with purpose. She didn't just sell numbers, she sold vision. By the time the meeting ended, the partnership was sealed. Her company's expansion into Europe was official. And yet, as she left the room to polite nods and firm handshakes, her thoughts weren't on revenue projections or press releases. They were still with the man who tried to keep her grounded, not by technical fault, but by bias. The deal she just secured was monumental, but the real weight of the day came from something quieter, the knowledge that she had walked into a storm and left it windless. That evening, she returned to her hotel overlooking the river. The city glowed beneath her window, but she didn't linger at the glass. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, slipped off her shoes, and reached for her phone. A message waited. Leonard, Elite Aviation issued a formal memo. Todd Hansen's employment terminated effective immediately. They're implementing new sensitivity protocols for all staff. Your report became a case study. She stared at the screen for a long moment, not because she was surprised, but because she understood what that line actually meant. A case study, not a scandal, not a crisis to cover up, but a turning point. She replied, about time. Let's talk tomorrow. Justice, she'd come to learn, didn't always arrive like a verdict. Sometimes it came quietly, an inbox notification, a procedural update, a name erased from a payroll, but it came. And when it did, she made sure it meant something. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It had taken one woman in one terminal to set off a chain reaction, not because she had shouted, not because she had fought with rage, but because she refused to sit still. The next morning, Layla rose early. No press interviews, no meetings, just a moment for herself before the next flight. Geneva was already beginning to fade behind her, and that was fine. She wasn't here for spotlight. She was here for change. The ride to the airport was smooth, familiar. She didn't speak much to the driver. Her thoughts moved like a checklist. Follow up with the European team, schedule the rollout strategy, prepare the press language for the expansion. But none of it felt heavier than what she had already carried. That weight had been burned off at 30,000 feet. Back at the private terminal, Marcus was already waiting near the stairs of the new crew-assigned jet, his uniform fresh, his stance composed. When he saw her, he smiled and nodded. She returned the gesture. Before boarding, he stepped closer, quiet but firm. "I just wanted to say what you did, what you stood for. I've never seen anyone handle something like that the way you did." She didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. He continued, voice low. "I've been in rooms where things like that happen, and no one ever speaks up. We all just move around it, pretend it's not there. You didn't. I won't forget it." She told him thank you, told him to keep going, to speak up when the moment called for it. That professionalism wasn't silence, it was action. He nodded again. No more words. They both had jobs to do. As she settled into her seat, her phone buzzed one last time. Another message from Leonard. "You handled today with your usual brilliance. Proud of you. Dinner tomorrow?" She tapped back. "Thank you, and yes, I'll need a glass of something strong." She set the phone down, leaned back, and let the engines rumble beneath her. The new pilot came over the speaker with practiced ease, welcoming her aboard. A simple courtesy, but one that had been denied to her just 24 hours earlier. The jet took off. The sky opened again. Far below, policies were changing, conversations were being had, memos were circulating. Not because someone had filed a complaint, but because someone had refused to be quiet. And for Layla, that was enough for now. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She just needed altitude. Weeks later, a quiet internal memo moved through elite aviation's ranks. It wasn't broadcast in press releases or paraded on social media. It arrived in the inboxes of pilots, crew, and corporate leadership under the subject line, Policy Update, Conduct Standards and Training Implementation. Attached was a short note from the CEO and a required registration link for the new mandatory diversity and sensitivity training. There were no names in the body of the memo, but everyone knew who it was about. Todd Hansen had been dismissed, effective immediately. No return flight, no reassignment, no statement to defend himself, just gone. The man who once strutted through private terminals with unquestioned authority had become a cautionary tale. His name would not be remembered with scandal, but as a turning point. Not for him, but for the system that allowed him to believe his assumptions were policy. Layla didn't celebrate. There was no champagne toast or victory lap. But when Leonard forwarded her the internal memo, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Not satisfaction, not relief, just acknowledgement. Something had shifted. And not just for her. She had flown hundreds of hours on dozens of jets, but never had she felt turbulence on the ground like she had that day in the terminal. What Todd had tried to do wasn't just personal, it was structural. He had wanted to deny her access not because she lacked proof, but because she didn't fit his picture of who belonged. That picture had cracked, and she had made sure it wouldn't be pasted back together without new rules. Later that afternoon, she took a walk through her company's downtown office, past the design floor and into the product innovation wing. Her team had gathered to review prototypes. She smiled briefly, nodded to her lead designer, then stepped aside. There was no need to interrupt the momentum. These were the spaces she had built, quiet, creative, capable. No need to speak about the flight or Todd or the report. Most of them had already heard. Some had asked questions. Others had simply nodded in respect. As she entered her office, a fresh bouquet of white tulips waited on the desk with a handwritten note. To the woman who refused to stay grounded, thank you for reminding us what altitude looks like. It wasn't signed, but she didn't need to ask. That evening, Leonard picked her up for dinner. They went to a quiet restaurant tucked into a side street, One of those places that didn't need a sign out front because the people who mattered already knew where to find it. They ordered whiskey. Neat. No small talk. He raised his glass first. To never letting anyone tell you where the ceiling is. She clinked hers softly, then sipped, then let herself breathe. Over appetizers, they talked about the Geneva deal, the European expansion, and what the next 6 months would look like. Logistics, hiring, brand language localization. Nothing dramatic, just building, always building. But then Leonard leaned back, eyes steady. They're going to study you, you know. Layla raised a brow. In corporate seminars, business school case studies, quiet circles that need loud examples. You didn't just handle it, you shifted the axis. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Because both of them knew the truth. What had happened at 30,000 feet wasn't just about a rude pilot or an uncomfortable flight. It was about the many unspoken ways power tries to disguise itself as protocol, and how rarely anyone challenges it when it does. After dessert, they walked to the car in silence. Geneva air brisk, clean. Layla looked up once at the night sky, not for meaning, just to see it. When she returned home, her inbox had already begun to refill. A request for an interview from a major business magazine. An invitation to speak at a global leadership summit. A note from a young woman on LinkedIn who had read about her through a whispered email thread and just wanted to say thank you. She didn't answer any of them that night. She closed the laptop, turned off her phone, and poured herself one last drink. The next morning, she would get back to work. There were contracts to finalize, retail partnerships to secure, a rollout campaign to approve, but for now, the stillness was hers. And somewhere at another terminal in another airport, a young black woman would board a flight, flash her credentials, and not have to explain herself twice, because someone already had. Weeks later, Layla sat alone in a quiet cafe just outside the city, a journal open in front of her and a half-drunk espresso cooling beside her hand. She hadn't planned to write anything. But something about the morning, the gray clouds rolling in without ceremony, the faint chatter of strangers behind her, the way no one looked twice when she walked through the door, reminded her of how far things had come and how far they hadn't. The Geneva trip was a memory now. The fallout from it still echoing in systems she had no interest in micromanaging. Elite Aviation had released a follow-up to its internal memo, a quarterly training series, a dedicated equity officer, a new reporting portal for bias-related incidents. Other companies had taken notice. A few had reached out quietly, asking if she might consult. She declined. This wasn't a side hustle. It was a moment. One she wasn't going to let be repackaged into a corporate keynote. She flipped a page in the journal, wrote down 3 words without thinking. Not done yet. The week before, she'd flown commercial, intentionally. Middle seat, no pre-boarding, no press. She wanted to remind herself how much of the world still moved on autopilot. How many women like her still got questioned, still got watched, still got underestimated. No one asked for her autograph, but someone did ask if she was lost. She wasn't. At the office, her team was thriving. The European expansion had gone live without fanfare. The rollout campaign leaned into luxury with subtlety and precision. Her leadership wasn't just felt, it was baked into the culture. Interns spoke up in meetings. Assistants got credit for big ideas. And for the first time in months, Layla could leave work at 5 without guilt. But what lingered wasn't the success. It was Claire. It was Marcus. It was the younger crew member at the gate who hadn't known what to say. So he said nothing. It was all the people who had witnessed what happened and hadn't turned away, but hadn't known what to do either, and how powerful silence could become depending on who broke it first. She'd stayed in touch with Claire. The young woman had messaged her a week after the incident, unsure if she should say anything, but needing to. Layla responded the same day, told her she'd done the right thing, told her it mattered. Claire was now training to become a flight operations coordinator. She said the encounter changed the way she viewed her own authority, that she didn't feel as invisible anymore, that maybe she could speak up sooner next time. Layla smiled when she read that, because that's all she'd wanted, not to make a point, not to get someone fired, but to make the next woman's load a little lighter, the next man's gaze a little clearer, the next team structure a little sounder. She finished the espresso and stood. The rain had begun, slow and uncertain. She didn't rush. Let it tap against her shoulders without reacting. She was flying again the next day, a new city, a new deal, a new crew. But this time she wouldn't be walking into a room full of doubt. She'd be walking into one full of memory and accountability, and that mattered more. That evening as she packed, her phone buzzed once more. A message from a college student, a young woman in Georgia, studying business, preparing for her first pitch competition. She'd heard about the Geneva flight through a classmate. She'd read a blog post about it. She just wanted to say that hearing Layla's story made her feel like there was space for her too. Layla read the message twice, then typed "there is," and if there isn't, make it. The reply came a minute later. "Thank you. I will." She put the phone down, zipped up her suitcase, and exhaled. The world didn't change with one confrontation. It never had. It changed in the ripples, in the way people carried themselves after, in the small acts of courage that followed someone else's loud one. She didn't need to be a hero. She just needed to hold the line long enough for someone else to step forward. And when that happened, she'd be there to watch, not to lead, but to witness, to remind them that they didn't have to rise alone, that the sky was never the limit. It was just the beginning.